Thanks for joining me. My name is Jordan Kasper. You've got my Blue Sky handle there. I'll have that at the end as well. I also have a link to the slides at the end. It's a fairly easy address to remember, but you can take a picture of that later. This is the state of open source in the federal government. I hope y'all are really interested. I've found 3 of my federal employee colleagues. Any other federal employees? No? All right, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. I actually will start with just why me? Why would you listen to me about this? I, in fact, am a federal employee, but I'll get to that in a minute. I'm a software engineer by trade. And I'm actually an open source maintainer and contributor, and I have been since about 2008. Anyone here use jQuery? Oh, come on. Okay, yeah, please. So my earliest contributions were some bug fixes in the jQuery library. In 2008, I think that was 1.2. It was either 1.1 or 1.2. I can't actually remember. I don't know if you remember, we were stuck on that version for a long time in the jQuery land. But I actually still maintain a number of libraries, so I'm an active contributor and maintainer and a participant in the open source ecosystem, and so that's maybe one reason. But the reason that you're probably more interested in is that in 2017, I entered federal service. Most of my career has been private industry, a lot of startups, some big companies. But in 2017, I joined the US Digital Service and went and worked at the DoD for 3 years, trying to modernize a lot of the technology there. While there, I helped write the DoD open source policy, which was signed out by the DoD CIO in 2022. I left DoD in 2020. It was written in 2018. So for my one DoD colleague, this is obvious, but that is in fact about how long it takes to get a lot of this stuff written. That policy is actually quite good. I would encourage you to go read it. There are tons of links in this slide deck, so you can get those afterward. I left federal service for a couple of years, and then I came back into the Department of Homeland Security, where I'm currently a senior technical advisor. And surprise, surprise, I helped write the 2023 DHS open source policy. I also wrote a whole bunch of guidance for it, which is not published yet, but I'm hoping is published pretty soon. And so one of the things that I focused on in both of these policies was actually contribution back to the open source ecosystem. And we'll talk a lot about that in a few minutes. One quick note, I am here in my personal capacity. I'm not here as a representative of the federal government. Anything I say here are my own views, because rules that have been imposed on us. So this is our agenda. We're going to talk about why open source. I'm going to glaze over this one because I'm singing to the choir here. But then we're going to talk about what the challenges are in the federal government specifically. We'll talk about the policy that's in place right now. We'll talk about the reality of what is actually happening in open source within the federal government. And then we'll talk about the possibilities. And again, these are my views and my opinions on how things maybe could go. But I think there are realistic possibilities in how we can improve open source in the federal level. I don't think I need a citation here in this particular group, but if you were listening to the keynotes, you know that open source is good, right? Let's review some of those reasons. Obviously, reusability. You build it once, you use it everywhere, anywhere, right? This is a huge aspect, and it requires some of the other things I'm going to talk about. In order to be reusable, you have to have this collaboration and contribution that you get from the community. But the other benefit here is groupthink, right? The hive mindset, if you will, of making something better. If a solo engineer within the IC, the intelligence community, is developing a particular script, that's great, but how many bugs is that one developer going to put it in there because they're thinking about it one way, right? There's a lot of opportunity for benefit in groupthink here. Security, again, I'm kind of speaking to the choir here. Security in open source is, in fact, fundamental and inherent in the system. A lot of that is because of the collaboration and the contribution. A lot of it is because of the group thought. A lot of it is because things are in the open, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. There's a number of studies here. There's a gentleman here, if you're not familiar with him, David Wheeler, who has worked in the government space for quite a while on open source security. You can go talk to the OpenSSF folks in the expo hall there. This is a pretty well-known thing, but we're going to talk a little bit later about the challenges within the federal government around security in particular. And of course, transparency, which leads to the security, right? If your code isn't transparent, if you can't see the vulnerabilities, then you're not going to be able to have that group hive mindset to be able to fix those vulnerabilities. Cost, and there's a big asterisk here. We all know that the total cost of ownership of your IT system, if you're using open source, is going to be less. That's an obvious. You heard the valuation statement from Mr. Nagel earlier in the keynote probably. But there's an asterisk because it isn't actually free. One is you have to have a lot of things involved to consume that open source securely and safely. But the other thing is that if we don't contribute back to that open source ecosystem, then it will collapse, and then we will lose all of this total cost of ownership benefit that we actually have. So sure, cost is a benefit, but big asterisk there. And then the last one, and this one, all these others are true of anyone using open source in the private industry, but this last one is really more specific to government, which is that it's for the people. We as taxpayers pay for all of the IT systems that the federal government creates and uses. And so open source is also a little bit more of a fundamental principle that I think is important at the federal level. So let's move on to the challenges. My little thing is not working, so I'm going to use arrows. The challenges of using open source in the federal government. Now, these things are in quotes, and they're in quotes because I heard them from people. So open source is insecure. We just talked about that, right? But let's talk a little bit more about why people in federal government tend to say that open source is insecure. A lot of it is because they say that they can't confirm the source of an open source piece of software. So if I'm pulling in a particular library, an operating system, whatnot, they want to know who's behind that. That's why Red Hat Linux, Enterprise Linux in particular, is so popular in the federal government. Why? Because there's a company behind it that will assure the security of that will take the accountability and the responsibility. How do I do that with a library that processes time zones and helps me with dates and times? It's very, very difficult to do, and it's difficult for the federal government to accept that. Now, there are lots of things that we can put in place to ensure the safety and security of the open source that we consume, but that's not what they're interested in. They're interested mostly in the paperwork exercise. And unfortunately, the open source ecosystem doesn't work that way. You can't confirm the identity of someone on GitHub, generally speaking. But I want to talk about one other aspect here. That was about consuming, right? Let's talk about publishing. They tell me open source is insecure for us to publish. Why? They say because then all of the bad actors will know our vulnerabilities. They will know all the things wrong with our software. And I say, bro, they know them. They're already there. They're already in the systems in a lot of cases. So that is not an argument against open sourcing it. In fact, it's probably an argument for open sourcing it earlier so that we can find those things before they become 0 days. It's illegal. Again, these are in quotes for a reason. Yes, this applies both directions, both consuming open source and publishing it. People, lawyers, actual trained legal professionals have told me that it is illegal for us to use open source. Now, you all know that that's nonsense, right? But there are nuances to it. The type of open source license does matter for us. GPL v1 is actually problematic for federal systems, especially if they are national security systems or things that are behind a wall where we can't republish it if we modify a library. We can't. And so there are some issues there. On the publishing side, they typically say it's all about intellectual property. We're going to talk about intellectual property in a minute, but essentially the way that the federal contracting system works is that when a contractor builds a system, they retain the copyright on all of that code. It is not, in fact, released to the federal government. A lot of people think that. Even if you get full data rights to your IT, the custom code that was developed, that doesn't mean you own the copyright. Contractor still owns the copyright. And an open source license releases rights from copyright. So the contractor has to either be on board or be told that they have to open source something. And we'll talk about that in a minute. These are in quotes. Someone has told me, we pay for it, it's ours, which is absolutely inane, and I'm not going to spend any time on it. It's your money that paid for it, so you should be able to see it. For those of you who don't know, this is Grace Hopper, Admiral Grace Hopper from the US Navy. She was a pioneer in computer science, not just in the federal space, but period in the industry. If you don't know much about her, I highly encourage you to go look her up. But in particular, we have had a drain of technical expertise and knowledge within the federal government over the last few decades. We have pushed much of that off to contractors. And I'm not opposed to the federal contracting industry. I'm opposed to the government not having technical expertise to call bullshit when contractors do stupid things. And I apologize to all the federal contractors out there, but I'm sorry, sometimes y'all just don't get it. And we don't have the technical expertise to say no. And that results in a lot of really poor systems being developed. And that kind of goes to this last one, which kind of is a roll-up of a bunch of the other ones, stagnation. This is both in the tech and the people. Now, you've probably heard of, maybe federal civil servants, not, just sitting in their warm, comfy jobs from various pundits out in the political world, right? That is not my experience. I find federal public servants to be exceptionally dedicated to their mission. However, a lot of them also don't keep up with industry trends. This is especially true in technology, and unfortunately, we need to improve that, and it's going to be the case for a while. This is different in different agencies. You know, people like NASA are a lot more forward-thinking than some other agencies that are out there that I've worked with. But it's also about the tech, right? Because a lot of times we create this IT system, we pull in all this open source tech, and then we create a nice wall around it and we put it over here. And then we never update it. And that stagnation of that technology system results in hordes of vulnerabilities. Libraries that haven't been updated in 5 years, or that they have the version that was last released 5 years ago, even though it has been updated. This is very, very common in our federal ecosystem. So those are some of the challenges that we face. And I want to talk about the policy in place, and then we're going to talk about the reality and how those kind of mesh, right? Ultimately, the root of a lot of our open source policy stems from the federal source code policy IM 1621. If you're not familiar, IM stands for memo. It's an OMB management memo, so the Office of Management Budget. 16 refers to the year, so 2016, 21 sequential, the 21st release. So IM 1621 is the federal source code policy, and it's where a lot of our open source derives from. However, the federal government has been doing open source a heck of a lot longer than 2016, and I'll show you some examples a little bit later. Most of this, by the way, focuses on basically how we acquire IT and to focus on COTS, commercial off-the-shelf software, versus custom developed, right? Don't build it if we don't have to. And so a lot of the focus of IM 1621 is around build versus buy. However, Section 5 is all about open source. In particular, it set up a pilot program to release 20% of government custom developed code as open source software. Anyone see a problem with that? What does 20% mean? Lines of code, projects, files, modules, agencies, people, labor hours. Literally all of those have been examples that I have heard from people in the federal government saying that one of those is right. Unfortunately, it was never cleared up which one was right, but it doesn't really matter because that pilot ended in 2019. Anyone think we hit the 20% mark? No. Really, the more interesting part of Section 5 was actually all this other stuff about participating in the open source community. A lot about better development practices, around community engagement, around really good documentation of the things that we are open sourcing so that people can actually reuse it and they can actually build upon it. But there's actually another section in here that might have been more important, and that was Section 4 about government-wide code reuse. You might say, but Jordan, government-wide doesn't mean open source. I disagree. The easiest way for one government agency to share code with another government agency is not by connecting those two agencies. It's by going open and allowing that agency to connect to it. I actually help administer a program where another agency wants to use it right now, and it has taken me months to get them access. They don't yet. The thing that Section 4 does is it really sets up the data rights to share code. And what it really says is you have to have those data rights. So remember we talked about IP and copyright earlier? The government needs to get full data rights to the custom code that's developed for it. If we get full data rights, we can share that code. We don't need the contractor's approval to do so. Essentially, they have given up that part of their copyright to the federal government. That's what this does, and that's why it's so important to have in our IT contracts. It is, in fact, pretty much standard practice now, but not at all agencies and not on all contracts. The other thing that it set up was a code inventory. Now, this code inventory is not about open source code. It's about all custom developed code. The federal government is supposed to inventory 100% of its custom developed code. I don't think I need to say it out loud, but we did not do that. It set up an organization called Code.gov. They operated under the General Services Administration, GSA. Code.gov was a relatively small team, but really important. They ran the site, Code.gov, and it had a lot of guidance for how to use open source in the federal government. They also did a lot of liaising between the open source community and agencies and agency to agency. They also had an audit system, if you will, for agencies to see how they were doing according to the IM 1621 requirements. That's all great. Well, Code.gov doesn't exist anymore. A lot of that guidance does exist. It's on digital.gov, and that's great. But the code inventory and the agency accountability is basically not being done at this point. However, that was federal executive branch policy. Last year, the US Congress passed the SHARE IT Act. No, I don't know what SHARE stands for, but yes, it is an acronym. And essentially what it says is all those good things that were in IM 1621 in the federal source code policy, yeah, you have to do those. It requires data rights to share code. And guess what? It requires government-wide code access and reuse. And guess what? It requires a code inventory. Sound familiar? Yeah, they basically read it. In fact, early versions, and you can go and see these on, what is the site, congress.gov. You can go and see early versions of the bill that actually just say you have to do all the things in M1621 that code.gov did. Now, whether we do those or not is another question, but there are actual time deadlines in here, one of which we missed, but that's okay, and requirements. And the Government Accountability Office, GAO, is actually able to audit agencies and compel them to complete some of these requirements. Let's talk about that code inventory. I want to show you briefly what it looks like. This is an excerpt from the DHS inventory. It's at dhs.gov/code.json. And in fact, most of these inventories are at the top level, the .gov TLD. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but it's a little project called Trust Email, put out by CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And you can see under the licenses, it's CC01. This is an open source project that CISA maintains. They actually maintain a lot of them. I only point out that this is what the example looks like. Notice there's no code or anything, right? It does give you a link to the repository, but that URL for the repository could easily be behind a wall, a firewall, access control. That's why this inventory was meant to be for all custom developed projects, so that you can see what the project is. You can see the tags there. I didn't list the tags here, but you could see what it was for. And so another government agency could say, oh, I need a reverse engineering script for malware. Oh, look, CISA's already done that. Let me just go and use what they have. Now, I might need to figure out how to contact them, and I'm not showing it in here, but there's actually a point of contact element that you're supposed to put in here as well, which it is there for this project. I just took it out for simplicity's sake. One more, Executive Order 14144, passed in January of 25. Now, if you remember, early January 25 was one administration. However, this is one of the executive orders that has in fact persisted. It's been edited, so there was edits just a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, but the section that I'm going to talk about is actually still there and relevant, which is section now 2C, it used to be 2E, and it basically directs CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, to create best practices for all federal agencies. And in particular, in bold here, best practices for contributing to open source software projects, right? How do we do that safely? How do we do that securely? What's the process? This is actually really, really important. And they would like to use the guidance that I've already written, but my guidance isn't public yet, so they're basically building it off of that. So hopefully we'll see some really good things coming out of CISA in the near future. Now, this was all federal level globally, right? However, many agencies actually have their own policies or their own guidance. I've mentioned DHS and DoD, but CMS, the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, basically have a default to open process, so does CISA. NASA has a great set of guidance on how they do open source and what's required there. GSA does as well, and there are others. I would love to tell you that there are dozens of others, and this was just a small sample, except that this is actually probably the majority of them that are publicly available, because most of them are actually internal documents, or they don't really have anything that really resembles an open source policy. They just have things that say, you can't do this, you can't do that. Also, most of these focus on the publication of open source and not the consumption, which is actually arguably the more treacherous area, and we're going to talk about that in just a minute. So, the reality of open source. Is anyone actually doing it, right? Yeah, my DoD friend over here is saying, yeah, we do. I will actually point out, this is not on my slide, but in fact, Transcom, the Transportation Command within DoD, does in fact have a number of open source libraries. And in fact, the system that was used for active duty personnel to change duty stations, called move.mil, was a project that I worked on when I was at DoD, and that was in fact done as open source by default. It was developed in the open. So there's a site here, you can just barely see the URL at the bottom, government.github.com/community. And of course, this is just GitHub orgs, but on this page, which I can't navigate very easily, you'll see that it's kind of broken up by country, and I bet you know what's coming here. Way down here, somewhere that I'm not gonna be able to find is US Federal. I don't have an internet connection right now, so you won't be able to see all the icons. But if you go to that site, you can look at, scroll down to the US Federal. There's 164 recognized GitHub organizations for US federal entities. That actually doesn't include the military. DoD has its own section within there, and so do US states, and so does US local. And so there's actually quite a few organizations that are in fact publishing open source software in one way or another. Do they have open source policies? Not that I know of, not that I can find, but they are in fact doing it. And I think that's really, really important. Can't go, where's my mouse? There it is. So let's look at just a few examples. I'm gonna start with SE Linux, Security Enhanced Linux. Anyone heard of Security Enhanced Linux? Yeah, well, a lot of you, great. So it's not really a distribution anymore. Actually, a lot of the components of SE Linux have been ported just into the Linux kernel. That was open sourced by the National Security Agency in the year 2000. It was given back. It's not open sourced as in they still run it. It is now a community project. It is no longer an NSA project. They do not, in fact, control the project. They contribute to it, but they don't control it. Year 2000, long time ago. That was not the earliest example. It's just one of the most visible examples. You've got the US Web Design System, put out by GSA and the TTS, the Technology Transformation Services. The US Web Design System is, in fact, the web design system that all federal agencies must use if they're creating a new website that faces the public. It is an open source project. Many, many agencies have contributed to it, and private individuals have contributed to it. There are downstream design systems based on it that contribute back modules when they create a new component, a new whatever. OpenMCT from NASA. This is a mission control technology framework. So if you want to have a mission control dashboard for your little space startup, NASA has an open source platform for you to use. And the most recent example, and I think one of the greatest, is IRS Direct File. This is a free online service for you to file your taxes, and the entire system, which includes all the documentation, all the tests, all the build artifacts, all of the infrastructure artifacts, was open sourced recently. And I think that's amazing. IRS does not have a public open source policy. I actually talked to one of my colleagues over there recently. It is not public. There is nothing public for you to see. And yet they were able to get this done and approved through all the wickets in the appropriate way, which I think is amazing. It took them a long time to do. So how much of the federal systems are open source? I don't know what to tell you guys. It's not great. We have tens of thousands of systems. We have billions and billions of dollars put into this. So what about the upstream open source that we rely on, right? We spend $100 billion in IT systems and cyber systems every year. The federal government does. At DHS alone, we probably have 10,000, maybe more than 10,000 different IT systems. Hundreds of those are actually considered mission essential or mission critical, things that cannot go down. How many of those do you think rely on open source? All of them. We are arguably the largest consumer of open source software in the world. It's arguable because I will accept arguments, but I don't know how you can argue against it. We have $100 billion going into it every year, and every one of those systems has open source in it. You saw stats earlier that said that 97% of organizations, no, it's 100. If it could be over 100, it'd be over 100%. But we might be one of the worst consumers of open source. As a whole entity, there are good pockets of people doing good open source work, contributing back to the ecosystem, but by and large, we're probably one of the worst. We don't file bugs when we find bugs in open source libraries. We don't contribute security patches back necessarily. We're just not good participants in that ecosystem. And so that needs to change. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we might do that in a second. So what's the process for using an open source library in the federal government? You generally have 3 steps, right? Your selection, your consumption, and then maybe your contribution or your maintenance or whatnot, right? So let's talk about selection. How would you all select an open source library? You might look at the functionality, right? Make sure it fits your need. You might look at the number of GitHub stars. You're probably gonna look at the number of contributors, make sure it's not like just one dude in his basement, right? You're probably gonna look at, maybe does it have tests? Maybe does it have some CI stuff? Does it have a security policy? Is it part of a foundation? Is there a company behind it that's like allocating resources? There's all these things that you might consider, right? Yeah, we don't do any of that. Like, none of it. There's no standardized process across the federal government. I have found very few agencies that have a standardized process for the selection of an open source library that you want to use. This is just not done in any sensible way. Individual IT programs sometimes have this. I know this because I have told them that they have to do it, and that is one of the authorities that I have at DHS. But really, we don't do that. We have lots of stale repos. We have projects that have no velocity, that have been completely abandoned. We have things that have single contributors. We have things, and this is something that is a little controversial, but that have foreign influence. For the federal government, we have to take that into account. If it's a library that has 100% from one country, we have to think about that. Private industry doesn't necessarily, but we do. Okay, what about the consumption of it? I mean, maybe we don't select them right, but we have like sane, modern build processes, right? No, of course we don't. We have none of that. We don't consume these things safely. Again, no standardized process across the federal government. We have very limited use of mirrors. There are some places where we're using good open source package mirrors, but that's very, very limited. And again, a lot of times it's for one IT project or one IT, not IT system, but like a set of projects. So a program office that has maybe a few systems. They might be doing that. And a lot of times, this is a one and done kind of situation. I've consumed that library. Why would I ever need to do that again? I think you all know why. And then of course, you know, the back end of that, contribution back to that open source library. If you find a bug, what do? Maybe you make a patch, contribute it upstream to the GitHub or GitLab or Bitbucket project, right? No, that's fine. Maybe you can't do that, but you file an issue, right? You go to GitHub and you create a new issue with that bug that you found or that security vulnerability, right? No, absolutely none of that. And again, a lot of this comes down to the contracting process. A lot of this comes down to intellectual property. A lot of it is privacy concerns, security concerns. Yes, air quotes around security there. But frankly, if you refer back to the challenges that I mentioned earlier, this is just very, very difficult for us to do. And again, a lot of times it comes down to the contracting system. So that's the reality. That's what's actually happening out there that I see across agencies. Again, there are pockets of good. There are places where people are doing this well. Those are very few and far between. So let's talk about the possibilities, because that was a lot of negative. But let's talk about the possibilities. The policy exists. We have good policy there to do good things. We need to build on it. We need to expand that. Definitely have a goal of increasing open source publication, right? For all those reasons that I talked about at the beginning, I want to increase the open source publication within the federal government. So how are we going to do that? First of all, we need very clear guidance on how to do that. And that needs to come from the top, and I mean from the White House / the Office of Management and Budget. If it comes from one agency, that's great. You saw that we had some agency policies out there, but it's got to come from a broader source. It's got to. We need to be building more modular and reusable systems. Right now, us open sourcing direct file is great for that kind of transparency reason, and people can see what's going on. But no one could like take direct file and just run with it. That's not a realistic expectation. But there are lots of things in there, which my source at IRS says they're trying to do, which is to actually extract from their modular pieces that they could then publish on their own and that other government agencies could use, right? That reusability piece. We need to make this a contractual requirement, in my opinion. In other words, an IT contract for custom developed software in the federal government should require that that software be open source by default. I have done this successfully at 2 different agencies. I believe it can be done at any agency. If you can do it at DoD and you can do it at DHS, I believe you can do that at any federal agency. This should be a requirement. And then lastly, we need to enforce these secure coding practices. Now, we're already kind of getting there because the NIST Secure Software Development Framework, SSDF, is actually a requirement now. It is a standard. That doesn't mean that people are actually adhering to it. We have Secure by Design for industry that CISA is putting out. We can take from those and we can put that into IT contracts that says you have to do these things, but the federal government has to enforce them, right? And that requires technical knowledge within the federal government, which again, we are lacking. Let's talk about another goal, securing government systems. Part of that is what I just talked about, right? Part of that is in fact more open source publication. But I think that we need more baseline selection processes. We already talked about that. We don't have a baseline. We don't have a standard. We need that. It needs to come from an authoritative source. We need to automate the scanning of that open source and its approval process. In other words, if I want to use a new open source library, I shouldn't have to wait months for a security review and a privacy review and an ethics review and a legal review. I should just be able to do that in days or maybe minutes, right? And so we need more automation around this. We need to be using mirrors. I'm just not even going to dwell on that. That's an obvious one. And we need more guidance around updating our open source libraries that we're using. In other words, when do I update an open source library? If I pin my dependency, when do I get a new pin, right? When do I go from 1.2 to 1.3? When do I go from 1.x to 2.x? We need better guidelines for how to do this because frankly, it's done differently everywhere. And there are definitely going to be exceptions, but we need to do this better overall. And then lastly, I have a goal of supporting a more secure open source ecosystem for everyone. This is not about the federal government. However, I want to use the federal government as a tool to do that. I think it needs to be a contractual requirement that any government contractor that fixes a security flaw in an open source project must contribute that security fix upstream. This is not what happens today, but it should be. That should be an absolute contract requirement. And if they don't do that, they should get fined and they should get dinged in their reviews at the end of their contract. We need to do more contributions just generally to open source software, right? We rely on a ton of open source software. This doesn't have to be big stuff, right? It doesn't have to be massive rewrites. It doesn't have to be massive new features. It could literally just be, oh yeah, I found this little bug and I fixed it for you. Here you go. Tiny things. We need grants for critical open source infrastructure. There's an example for this in Germany. It's called the Sovereign Tech Fund. I highly encourage you to look it up. Basically, they give grants, small grants, 5,000, 10,000, at the high end, 100,000 for an open source project to run critical infrastructure they need to secure their systems. This is just scanning software. It is a GitHub enterprise license. It is basic stuff that that project needs to be able to support a secure version of their software. And we need to be an active participant in the community. This goes back to, if you remember, all the policy they've had before, the federal source code policy and the Share IT Act, that basically say that we need to be participants in the community. We should be doing that. These don't have to be big fixes. They can be very small contributions. And if we do this right, we could be injecting 100,000, maybe 500,000 developers into the open source ecosystem to help support it. Whereas right now we have a drain of open source contributors and maintainers. Let's flip that and do it the other way. So what can you do, right? What are the takeaways? If you're a federal contractor, do better. You can do this on your own. You don't need it in the contract. You don't need more policy. Just do better. Just do it better. As a federal employee, push for open source standards, push for open source policies, push for open by default. Start taking the things you're learning from the sessions here in the keynotes to push for that in your own agency. And as a private individual, honestly, just keep contributing. Contribute to government open source, right? Go look at OpenMCT from NASA, or go look at the US Web Design System and make it better for us. But also, maybe think about the regulations that we're putting out and comment on them. There's a site called regulations.gov. The federal government is required to post proposed new regulations there for comment for a set period of time. You can filter those on information technology regulations. Go and comment on them. Tell us how we should be doing it. That's it for me. I'm going to leave this slide up in a second, but I'm first going to show you that at the end of this, there's a bunch of other links and stuff. I highly encourage you to go look at those. So there are a bunch of other links. jordankasper.com/OSSInGov, and you've got my handle there. I appreciate you coming out. I have 7 minutes, and I would love to answer any questions you have about open source in the federal government. I will obviously also be here at the conference for the rest of the week, so feel free to find me. I will absolutely be wearing a flat cap, so you can just look for the guy in the flat cap. Although there's a few of us, so maybe look at my face first. Any questions? And obviously feel free to get up and leave if you don't have questions or you're not interested in them. No questions. I burned through that. Yeah, go ahead.
When we were talking about the federal government creating custom software, are government employees actually doing software development, or is it typically
Sure. Are government employees doing software development? The answer is yeah. However, not mostly, right? The vast majority of agencies rely on the federal contracting industry to create their custom developed software. There are people in the federal government doing software development. You have a number of people at DoD. You actually have military service members that are doing active software development. I have witnessed them, but it's still mostly contractors. Again, different agencies are different. NASA has a little bit more in-house. The Customs and Immigration Services component within DHS has more in-house. CISA has more in-house, but by and large, it's federal contractors. If you go by numbers, it's probably 100 to 1. Yeah.
One of the big challenges in open source is simply figuring out who's using your software and what they're doing with it. It seems like it ought to be possible to organize some kind of a census of like civilian federal government users, something
Yeah.
like that. It could be a huge contribution to the open source community, simply some data.
Yeah, so a good thing to know would be who's using a particular open source project or the project that you might be contributing or maintaining, and how might we do that at the federal level. So there are actually a couple of ways. We're going into a state where we're probably going to have requirements on contractors to give us SBOMs, software bills of materials, for the technology that we are using, and that generally applies to COTS software right now, commercial off-the-shelf software, right? However, in the future, I think it is highly likely that an ATO, an authority to operate for a government IT system, will require an SBOM for that custom developed system. And if we have those, and we publish them, which I believe we should, then they could easily be consumed by some other system. So you could say, so similar to how you saw the inventory of custom developed code, if we had that and a link to the SBOM, you could easily consume that inventory and then consume all those SBOMs and then tally up, oh great, so 1,000 of the DHS systems are using this, are using PyTorch. Follow up?
Yeah, so one of my big objections to the attestation system is the repo is not readable by external users. So, for instance, if I contribute an attestation, I don't even get to see who in the federal government is using that software or even who requested the attestation.
Yeah,
That to me is a very, I understand it's intended.
so the argument is that the SBOM does not necessarily show you who's using it, and because some of those things are behind a wall that you can't actually access.
Right, really, I was talking specifically about the portal
So,
secure software development.
so again, that goes to the code inventory that's out there, and if you combine that code inventory with SBOMs, then you would have all of the IT systems and all of the things that they depend on. Now, those things might not be accessible to you, the actual repositories, understood. But if the SBOMs are accessible, and the inventory is accessible, then you would get that. The Share IT Act actually requires that we have that code inventory, so you get that first part. We do not currently require government IT systems to publish their SBOMs. However, I think that's something that we should push for, and it's something that I think the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency is thinking about currently. Other questions? Is GitHub the chosen repo platform? Absolutely not. I pointed out the government.github.com site only because it is one place where you could go to see that, but there's a number of IT systems that are actually on GitLab. I would argue that there's probably more use of GitLab in the federal government than there is GitHub, only because it's so much easier and cheaper to deploy GitLab internally as in our own instance. There's a lot of organizations that are running GitLab CE, the community edition, internally. And so, but Git is definitely, I would say, the default platform, just not GitHub per se.
For the more private and older repo platforms like CVS, Subversion, maybe your initiative to
Yeah, so for older platforms like CVS, Subversion, even just like older Git platforms, is there an effort to convert those? I would argue there's an effort to get rid of those systems, and that is the right way to do that. But no, there's no specific or coordinated effort that I know of to get off of Subversion, for example. Any other questions? Well, again, I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Feel free to find me and ask me anything about federal open source.